But it goes back to this conversation about where's your emphasis? Where's my emphasis? Is my emphasis on all that I have not done? Here's something I want to tell you about your emphasis. Wherever you're putting your emphasis will have a tremendous effect on your life. What do I mean by that? Well, there's an interesting thing that happens when we're talking about emotional health and emotional issues that it can kind of seem counterintuitive. Let me tell you what I mean by that. In sports, say baseball. In baseball, let's say that a pitcher is pitching very poorly. How do you fix that? How does the manager or the coach, does he fix that? How does he address it? Well, he tells you you're doing a lousy job. That's how he fixes it. You as a pitcher in sports, knowing that you're doing a lousy job, what does that cause you to do? It causes you to try harder, doesn't it? That is the way it works in sports. I'm sure it's the same in football and everything else. You say to a linebacker or something, you're doing a terrible job. You're doing a terrible job. Well, that guy says, well, I don't want to lose my spot on the team, so I'm going to try even harder. And boy, he hunkers down and he just tries harder than he's ever tried before in his life, right? That makes sense. And that's typically the way we think of things. It's got to be handled that way, right? If you're hard on a person, then that will cause them to try harder and they'll do better. But when we're talking about emotional health and emotional issues, it don't work like that. It works the opposite. And I'll tell you why. The reason it works the opposite is because emotional unhealth or emotional disorder is built on shame already. You remember that wheel I told you about with my father? He already feels like he's a piece of trash. So he treats other people, he behaves in trashy ways. And then afterwards, he looks at what he's done, and here's the mistake that unhealthy people make. They don't look at the thing they've done and say, that thing I did is crappy. What mistake do we make when we're unhealthy? We say, that thing I did is proof that I'm crappy. And that's shame. When it comes to emotional health, remember we were talking about sports and how it's logical that when a pitcher is not pitching well, you call him out. You call him out and you tell him, you suck. You're terrible at pitching. These are all the things you need to fix. And he goes, oh man, coach is right. I am terrible. I need to fix these things. And he hunkers down and he fixes those things. But do you remember what I told you? That when it comes to emotional health, it's completely the opposite, because unhealth is already built on shame, and shame already tells you that you're the problem. You're the problem. And if you're doing something wrong, what do you identify that thing you're doing wrong as? The proof that you are the problem. So a funny thing happens when it comes to emotional health, and we emphasize the negative. You know what it is? I already gave you the example of my dad. In matters of emotional health, the more you emphasize the negative, the more you encourage negative non-action, such as lack of caring, a lack of effort. See how it's entirely different from things like sports and that sort of thing. In sports, when you emphasize the negative, the tennis player or the baseball player says, man, I gotta really hunker down on this and improve this. So they try even harder, they work even harder, and yes, they improve. But in matters of emotional health, because it's all built upon a foundation of shame, the opposite happens. When you point out and emphasize the negative, that only encourages negative non-action, a complete failure to even have the desire to act, lack of effort. But what happens when you emphasize the positive? So there are all these negative things, but what happens when you say, let's not emphasize all those negative things. Let's instead look for the good things and emphasize those. Then what happens? Exactly the opposite of what happens in sports and these other things. Think about, again, the pitcher in baseball. He sucks. He's doing a terrible job. He hasn't been trying enough. And the coach says, well, yeah, there's a lot of negative things there, but let's emphasize and focus the positive. What happens? In that setting, what happens is that the pitcher says, okay, well, I don't even have to try then. I'm doing fine. And the coach seems to be happy with me. So I'm happy with me, and I don't have to try any harder than what I am. And he continues to suck. And he gets even worse. But not in emotional health. What happens in emotional health instead? The exact opposite. Why? Because it's built on a foundation of shame. So in emotional health, when you are trying very hard, but there's all these negative things, you're doing this wrong, you're doing that wrong, you're failing to do that, and you're failing to do this. But you choose to focus upon and emphasize the positive. So you say, I do know that there's a lot of negative there that exists, but I'm going to kind of de-emphasize that, and I'm going to find the positive things that I'm doing and the positive things about my recovery, and I'm going to emphasize that and celebrate that. What happens? The more you emphasize the positive, the more you encourage what? Positive action. That's true in recovery. It's true with emotional health. It's counterintuitive, I know, but it's the truth. And think about this. People who are unhealthy have already been punishing themselves for sometimes 50, 60, 70 years. They have done their time. There is nobody punishing that can punish them more than they are already punishing themselves inside. You see, because their constant dialogue with themselves, inside of themselves, is I'm worthless. You're inherently devoid of value. They've been beating themselves to death with this message for their entire lives. Anything negative or highlighting the negative or focus upon the negative is only going to feed what they're already doing to themselves. They have paid their dues. So even though it's counterintuitive, with matters involving emotional health, the counterintuitive thing is the right thing to do. De-emphasize the negative, focus upon the positive. The more you emphasize the positive, the more you encourage positive action.